Hey everyone, I'm Lauren Stein, the Manager of Implementation at Acctivate, and we're here to talk about some tips and tricks. One topic of discussion is the requested ship date defaults for sales and purchase orders. For sales orders, the requested ship date can mean a couple of different things depending on your internal processes, but usually relates to the requested date to be shipped or the date the customer requested the order. There is a setting in configuration management for both sales and purchasing which sets the number of days to ship for these requested dates. For sales, if it typically takes you 2 days to get an order out the door, you would set this setting to 2. This also correlates to the number of days before requested ship date to start order picking. So when using mobile picking, you will see a certain list of orders based on this setting and the order requested dates. For purchasing, the meaning changes a little bit. If you have an approval process, the requested date should reflect the number of days it usually takes to get the PO approved and sent to the vendor. If you do not have an approval process, go ahead and set the days to ship in the purchasing options to 0, because the requested ship date is what's shown on a printed PO as the PO date. Therefore, you can think of the requested date on the PO as the PO date, and you can see the date issued, requested, and entered on the additional info tab of the purchase order if you needed to see the difference or the time difference between entering a PO, requesting a PO, and issuing a PO. Also, as a side note, the date time on the additional info tab for these different status changes is shown as text rather than specific timestamps, but you can hover over it and it will show you the actual date, the specific date and time that it was changed. So let's go ahead and jump into Acctivate, and we'll go to Configuration Management. Sales orders, we'll start there, and order options. So we have this days to ship is set to 7. So what that means is the requested ship date to get the orders out the door is typically 7 for this company. And then we've also got this picking days before requested ship date to start picking. So that is actually going to filter out orders based on the requested ship date for the sales order whenever you're using the mobile picking feature on the Acctivate mobile warehousing devices. And then alternatively, we have the purchasing options for purchase orders. The same is set here for 7. And that's because I've got my default order status for purchasing to be request for quote. So that means that this company does have an approval process for their purchase orders. So this is going to be the default status for the purchase order when you create it. Based on what you set here, it gives you the ability to limit what order statuses you have for purchase orders. So let's say this one's starting as request for quote. So the new purchase orders are going to be request for quote, and the requested date is going to default to 7 days after today. And then they'll also have pending approval and then issued. And issued means it's ready to go, send to the vendor, and then you're going to be waiting on receipt. If you do not have an approval process, I recommend starting out as issued and setting the days to ship to 0. Because again, the requested date is the date that's going to default on the purchase order for the PO date. And just real quick, I'll show you that if you hover over the information on the additional info tab, you see this entered by 2 hours ago, but if you hover over it, it gives you the actual date timestamp. So I know we've had some questions in the past about, okay, it says 2 hours ago or a month ago, but what date was it actually done and what time? You just hover over it and it will show you that detailed information. All right, and then another note in configuration for sales orders, there are a bunch of other order options to choose from. I just spoke about the picking option, days to ship for requested date, and there's also the days to pick for promise date above the days to pick for requested date for mobile picking. Another option which comes up quite a bit is the use order number as invoice number option. For the customers of ours that prefer to research invoices in QuickBooks rather than Acctivate, we definitely suggest utilizing this option. So this way there's no confusion on which invoice is linked to which order from Acctivate. So when you create invoices manually in QuickBooks, if you don't create an invoice based on a sales order that was created in QuickBooks, then the sales order number field on the sales invoice window isn't even available. Like, it's hidden in QuickBooks. So the invoices coming from Acctivate are not linked to sales orders in QuickBooks since we only sync the invoices. We do not sync over the sales orders. So the invoices created from Acctivate and synchronized to QuickBooks don't have the sales order number field available. Therefore, it's not something that we can synchronize into QuickBooks. And I know we've had customers in the past that have complained that it's hard to research which sales invoice is related to which sales order, to which our initial response is always, well, you should research it in Acctivate rather than in QuickBooks because everything is in Acctivate related to your items, including sales orders. But for those of you, again, that are more comfortable doing it in QuickBooks, then we definitely suggest using the order number as the invoice number. And if you're worried about partially invoiced orders having the same invoice number, we definitely have you covered. So the first invoice that you create, if you're doing partial invoices, will match the original sales order number exactly. The second invoice will have -1. The third invoice will be the sales order number -2, and so on. So this way, even when you're in QuickBooks, you're still able to match up those multiple invoices to a specific sales order because that sales order is referenced on every single one of those invoice numbers. So let's take a look at what that looks like in Acctivate. So I'm going to go ahead and override the schedule quantity. So this is how you do a partial invoice for those of you customers that maybe don't know how to do this yet if you're new. I'm going to go ahead and do this as 1 and this as 10. And then you can see when you override the schedule quantity, it puts the remaining quantity in back order. So I'm going to hit save. I'm going to create the invoice. I'm not going to put any payment or do any special things like printing or anything like that. Invoice. And then if we go to the invoices tab, you can see that the first invoice number matches the order number exactly, A1199T. So let's say we're a couple of days later and we want to go ahead and invoice the rest of the order. So we'll hit edit. We'll change the status to scheduled. This as a side note, this can be done in Order Manager, but since we're working on the specific invoice, I'm just going to go ahead and do it from the sales order window itself. Scheduled. That will check current item availability and schedule the remaining quantity left to be sent to the customer. We're going to go ahead and create invoice. Again, I'm not going to enter any payment details or anything like that. Invoice, and if we go to the invoice tab, we've got A1199T-2 for the second invoice. And so if you need to invoice multiple invoices, like maybe 3 or 4, again, it's going to be -2, -3, -4, depending on how many invoices you create. And then when you synchronize that over to QuickBooks, it's easily recognizable on which sales order that invoice is related to. If you wanted to go ahead and turn that option on in your current system, if you're not already using it, I definitely suggest checking out your numbering setup in configuration management to make sure that if you turn that option on, there's not going to be any invoice numbers that were already in use that match your current order numbers. In the demo company, there's no problem with toggling that option on and off because the invoices and the orders in the configuration management both have prefixes set, so the numbers would never be the same if you go back and forth between those options. And I'll show you that here. So we've got prefix for invoice is set to B, prefix for order is set to A. If you're using the order number as the invoice number, the options that you set for the invoice numbering are ignored, and it's specifically related to the order number. Another extremely common topic related to configuration management is the cost offset account assignment and use. So the only way to assign a cost to a fee or a labor item is to assign a standard cost to it on the warehouse being utilized on whichever transaction you're using this product on. This standard cost also needs an account assigned to it for the journals created for posting these transactions. This cost offset account is used similarly to the inventory asset account for inventoried items, but it's used for the non-inventoried items. So if you're using like a labor item for your assembly sessions, you have to tell Acctivate what account to use, since labor is not an inventoried item, to offset that cost roll up into the final good. You can assign a different cost offset account per item type, per warehouse for any non-inventoried items. All accounting transactions, including standard costs for non-inventoried items, must have an offset account due to the nature of double entry accounting. These accounts are typically going to be cost of goods sold or expense type GL accounts and are used to offset things like accounts payable if we're creating a vendor bill for a subcontracted labor, or even payroll expense if you're doing labor in-house and then you need to obviously pay your employees. So you would offset this cost offset account to payroll expense and then eventually to the bank because you're going to be paying your employees. So let's take another look at configuration where these are assigned, and then we'll also take a look at an item that utilizes standard cost so you can see where to assign the standard cost. All right, and that's going to be found in the warehouse section of the inventory. So inventory, warehouse. And we've got this Dallas warehouse. Now it's going to default to the inventoried section. That's your normal GL accounts, inventory asset, accrued purchase receipts, inventory adjustment, gain loss on inventory, inventory adjustment. If you wanted to default the issue GL account to inventory adjustments, and then also the accrued landed cost account. But for non-inventoried items that are standard costs, you need to assign a GL account for these specific item types. So that's why you see non-inventoried, labor, other charge, and shipping. And each of those can have its own unique GL account, as well as each warehouse can have different GL accounts for these non-inventoried item types. So that would be a way to break out which GL account to use for these types of items. And you can use warehouse on the transactions that you're using these items on to choose which cost to use. All right, and then where you assign standard costs, because it is something that you would set manually, that's going to be on the product itself. And you can see that we've got the cost method set to standard, and then we've also got a standard cost of 10. Now this is for the D warehouse, and if we look at the F warehouse, the standard cost is 9.5. So let's say the cost to process these items or use labor in Fort Worth is slightly lower than it is in Dallas. All right, and then we'll get into the use of using standard cost on assemblies here a little bit further into the presentation. Reports are always a topic of discussion in implementation and support. Before we get into specific portions of the report catalog, it's good to remind everybody that to modify reports for Acctivate, you use Crystal Reports. This is a full-fledged reporting tool where you can connect to the database and use whatever data necessary to get the reports that you need, including a full list of functions. If you don't have someone on staff who can work with Crystal Reports, we can do slight modifications in-house, but when it comes to complete rewrites or custom reports, we have a great list of report writing consultants that are familiar with both Acctivate and Crystal Reports to assist in your reporting needs. When doing custom reporting, make sure to save the reports in the proper file location. If you're modifying a standard Acctivate report, it needs to be saved in the custom reports folder prior to making any changes. This way you won't override the original on accident, and then maybe while you're working on it, somebody tries to run it and whatever modification you've done you haven't tested yet and it completely breaks the report. You don't want to have to go try to, contact us for the original report file because you accidentally overrode the standard report. So just make it a habit if you're customizing the standard Acctivate reports to go ahead and save that report either in the custom reports folder if you want it to be immediately available, or another file location that you can copy it into the custom reports once it's ready or completed. If you need the new report to replace the standard report, name it exactly the same as the original in the standard report location and save it in the custom reports. Acctivate uses reports listed in the custom reports folder before it uses the standard when the name matches the standard report. If the name is different than the standard report name, let's say you're doing an alternate sales invoice format, you'll need to give it a different name than the standard, and then also you'll need to set it up manually in the Acctivate report catalog, whether that's if you're doing a sales invoice, you could copy the standard sales invoice and then, update the copied format to reflect the changes. Also, whenever you request a custom report modification, a lot of times our support team and the Acctivate consultants will send you an ActRPT file. This is a file that has not only the report file saved, but also the selection prompts already set up. So what you would do is you would just import that file into the report catalog directory, and it goes ahead and puts it in the right section of the report catalog, as well as sets up the selection prompts for you without having to do it manually. And the easiest way to find your custom reports folder is definitely through the help menu in Acctivate. So let's take a look at how to find that. That's going to be through the help menu, Acctivate support, email Acctivate log file, and then you click open folder. So that's going to open the folder to where the Acctivate logs are. But as you can see here, we've got Acctivate data. So we're going to do Acctivate data, and then custom reports. And this is where you would save any custom report file that you want to be accessible inside of Acctivate. All right, each section of the user permissions and configuration management has an option for certain groups of reports. We've got customers, inventory, sales, purchasing, issues, and so forth. They can all have their reports turned on or off for certain users. The system admin can use the permission groups on each report to move around the permission groups to give certain users limited access to specific reports. For instance, cost-sensitive users can only have permission to view order processing reports and maybe no inventory reports. But the reports not showing cost for inventory can actually be toggled to be order processing group reports. So that way they may not have accessibility to the transaction reports that show cost, but they need to be able to run reports on, let's say, like the inventory product report or some other report that doesn't show cost. So you can toggle those permission groups in the report catalog to adjust what users have access to what reports. Like I said, the transactions reports, so when you post an inventory receipt or an inventory assembly session, they will show cost. And turning the view cost option to no will not limit the ability for that user to see cost on a printed report. It's only for the cost field in the desktop version of Acctivate. So if you want them to also not see costs in the reports, then you would also need to turn off inventory reports. So that's kind of where I'm going with in the changing the permission group for reports that don't have cost on them to be a different permission group like order processing or something. So that way you can grant them access to reports that don't have cost, but then you can remove access for the reports that do have cost. And that is in the report catalog section of configuration management. So you can see this permission group is set to inventory. So a user with inventory reports set to yes will see any report that's in the inventory permission group. Same goes for customer info. It's going to be anybody with the ability to view customer reports, order processing, purchasing, job management, and issue tracking as well. Issue tracking is actually business activities, for those of you that aren't aware of that. There are also what's called document types for each report. This tells Acctivate where the users can print the specific report if it's on a window like a sales or purchase order. For instance, the sales order document type would be used for any order type form to be printed from the print order buttons. The sales order pick ticket type relates to the second icon. Here, let me open Acctivate again. So you can see here we've got sales order picking, sales order shipping. So the sales order pick ticket type relates to the second icon in the sales order window and also the order manager windows to print pick tickets, as well as the print pick ticket utility. So that gives you different formats to print from that utility. The sales order shipping forms will print under the third icon on the sales order window or under the shipping forms in order manager. The sales invoice type gives you an alternate invoice formats when multiple forms exist. So you can see the full list here in configuration management. We've got sales invoice, sales order pick ticket, shipping. We've also got sales quote and then sales quote second button, third button, all these different options. And this tells Acctivate where to drop that form in those different menus whenever you're printing from the windows. And that also goes into play for the dashboard panel. So for those of you customers that want to add reports to the dashboard, you would have to make sure that this document type is dashboard panel for those reports to make sure that you have them available on the dashboard. All right, to add, remove, or modify a report filter, you would choose the report, click on the selection prompts tab for that report, edit the filters as needed. You'll need to choose a field from the database, which is listed on the report, give it a name, and choose what type of values are accepted for this filter. Acctivate will default the name and type based on the field, but you can override this default value whenever you're setting up these filters. So if the type is set to text, the user will be expected to enter the value they're searching by typing it in manually. They will not be given a list to choose from. So a common change would be to go from text to, let's say, product class, if you want to filter on product classes, or warehouses, so that way you have a drop-down list of the warehouses or product class that you want to filter on. And that's still in the same section of configuration management. So in this selection prompts, here, let me make this a little bit bigger. You see product class ID is set to text and the prompt is product class ID. But maybe your users don't know the full list of product classes, or they could be entering them in wrong. Like maybe they misspell it, because if you misspell it and you filter on something that's misspelled, it doesn't match anything in the database, the report's going to show up blank because there's no match. You would select product class here, and then that way when you run the report, the selection is not going to be a text field, it's actually going to be a drop down. And I changed that for the inventory products. And we'll go take a look at that report here in a second so you can see that now there's going to be a drop down for that report filtering. Another side note for custom reports is whenever you're updating selection prompts, either for the standard reports or even for custom reports that match the standard, or any custom report that you're creating manually, make sure to check this box to not override changes to the definition during Acctivate updates. That especially goes for the standard reports that you're updating the filters for. That way the update's not going to modify the changes that you've already made. For those of you that are importing the ActRPT files, here we have this export, so you can export a report into an ActRPT to be imported, and next to it you have import report. And then it'll prompt you for the file location to the ActRPT file, and it'll import it into the report catalog as it is set up in that ActRPT. So let's take a look at the new filter that we've added, or that we've modified. Again, the same section is to add prompts. So inventory products, product class, equal to, and now we can select a specific product class and run the report. Because before it was set to text, you would actually have to type ACC if you have equal to. If you want it to be like, so maybe you don't know the full value, you can say AC or A, and that way it'll be a little bit more lenient on the value that it's looking for in the database. And before we move on to the next topic, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to add a new prompt so you can see how that goes. And we'll go back to the inventory products, edit, and then in the field we'll select this, and let's see what is not here. Maybe product warehouse summary and warehouse. Select that, and then you can see that it defaulted to warehouse, so this will be a drop down, and it also defaulted the prompt to say warehouse, and you can make this whatever you want. And you can also make it required and move them up and down by using these up and down arrows right here. Alright, when exporting and emailing reports, there are some differences between doing so from a form printed on a window like the sales order or from the reports menu. There has been some confusion related to the emailing side of this topic. If you choose to email a sales order via the sales order print dropdown, so you're choosing email sales order on the sales order window or on Order Manager, the email address will default to the one listed on the order as the contact. If you go to print the sales order form and you preview that sales order, and in the preview you click email, you'll be prompted to enter the email address manually. So that's because when you're choosing the option to email sales order as the form from the window itself, it's going to pull the information from that window. If you're clicking the email button on the preview, it's going to assume you're going to email that outside of the contact for that form. Maybe you want to email that to somebody internally instead of emailing it to the customer. And that goes the same for a purchase order, windows, or any other form that you're emailing. If you preview the report and then click email, you're going to have to manually enter in that email address. So we definitely suggest choosing the option to email that form from the drop-downs. Alternatively, you can also save as certain file types once you've previewed the report based on the specific drivers installed on your computer. So to do so, in the report preview, you click export, you navigate to the proper file location, you give the file a name, you choose the type, and you save. Here, we'll do it from a sales order so you can see this difference here. We'll add an email. So if you do email order, that's going to drop the email address from the contact into the to field as a default. And it's also going to attach the order as a PDF. Now, if you do print order and you do it from the preview and you do email, no default in the to comes in. It still adds the order, but it just says order.pdf. It doesn't say the actual order number in the file name, but you would have to manually type the information here in this email window. And again, that's typically under the assumption that when you're doing it from the preview, you're emailing it to somebody maybe in-house, or maybe if you're doing 3PL and you're not using EDI, and you want to email a list of pick tickets, you would click this email button from within the preview of the multiple pick tickets, and you would send that to your provider. All right, and then export is this little save icon. And then you can navigate to where you want to save it, give it a name, and then you would select a type. Now this list right here is going to be based on the drivers that you have installed on your own computer. A lot of these are going to be available to all of you. Again, it just depends on the specific drivers that you have. It defaults to PDF because that's honestly the nicest way to print it, but you definitely can choose any of those options. And the same goes for open. You can open it in Excel, Word, PDF Viewer, or in a web browser. This is just going to open the document. It's not going to save it to be opened in the future. Okay, so for purchasing, you have a couple of options in correcting received quantity and or price. We do get asked about this quite often. It's very common, if you have the received PO in full, for somebody to accidentally just go ahead and receive it in full, even if you only received a partial quantity. So to correct an incorrect quantity, you can either void the original session to repost correctly, or create a new receipt session from the original purchase order to post the difference to either remove or add to what was originally received. So let's say you originally received 10, because that's how many you ordered, and you've got that option to receive purchase orders in full checked, but you only received 8. So what you would do is you go back to the original purchase order, or select the PO in the inventory receipt window, and then post a -2 because you originally posted a received quantity of 10. And so when you post it, the net balance of the quantity received will be what you actually received, which is 8. So as long as you're creating the receipt related to a specific PO, these different receipts, the purchase order itself will reflect the total quantity received after you've posted both of those transactions. So it'll say quantity received of 8, ordered 10, outstanding 2. For price adjustments on receipts, honestly, the best way, if you don't want to go through and void a receipt just to correct a price, is really just to create the PO invoice with the proper price. Because once you create that PO invoice and you update the price to be what you've actually paid, creating that invoice will update all related receipts to match what you actually paid to the vendor. So that way your inventory value matches what you've paid to your vendor, regardless of what that original receipt price was. If the bill was created with the wrong value, so you've already created the vendor bill, somebody mistyped it, and you've maybe even synchronized it to QuickBooks already, open the purchase invoice in Acctivate, void it, and recreate it properly with the correct price in Acctivate. Once you run another sync, the sync will actually void and recreate the invoice, the vendor bill in QuickBooks, just like you did in Acctivate. So there won't be any duplicate PO invoices in QuickBooks. So let's take a look at this in action in Acctivate, and let's take a look at purchase order 1264. Now this one's going to be a little bit different than the example that I just went across, because we've ordered one case, but for some reason somebody put received 0.05 cases. So we have an outstanding quantity of 0.95. So what you would do is you would click receive, and so you would go ahead and let it default to the outstanding quantity, which is 0.95, and you would post it. And so now the purchase order will say that you've received 1. All right, so there are quite a few of our customers who utilize an in-transit or on-the-water warehouse. So this means that they're going to be receiving into an in-transit warehouse and need to transfer those items to physical stock once it reaches a local port. To make this process easier, we have added the functionality of importing transfers. So what you can do is you can open the original purchase order, right-click on the PO detail grid to send the details to Excel, and use that Excel spreadsheet to import that as an inventory transfer. If you have multiple warehouses that you're going to be transferring into from an in-transit warehouse, it may be a good idea to set up multiple transfer templates for each warehouse combination so the users can just simply choose the proper template when importing instead of having to edit the template each time to choose which warehouse they're transferring from and to. All right, so let's go back into Acctivate and we'll take a look at this. I don't have an in-transit warehouse set up in my demo company, but I definitely have multiple warehouses just as a whole. So let's take a look at this. I've got this 1261. Now what you would do is, let's just imagine this warehouse D is actually an in-transit warehouse or an on-the-water warehouse. And we've already received it into the on-the-water, and now let's say, maybe a couple weeks later, if you're ordering from China and you're in the States, you receive that shipment into your actual physical stock. So you right click on the grid, you click send to Excel. That's going to create an Excel spreadsheet with the details of this purchase order grid in the Excel sheet. Save it in a specific location. I'm not doing that right now because my VM that I'm using for the Acctivate demonstration doesn't have Excel installed on it. But let's take a look at the spreadsheet just through the import data utility. So you go to import data, transfers, and you see this, I've got transfer D to F. So if you've got multiple ports or multiple warehouses across the seaboard, you can set up an inventory transfer import template for each of those combinations. I'm going to do edit mapping just so you can see what this spreadsheet looks like when you export it. It gives you the line number, the line type, product ID, vendor product ID, the received quantity unit, and then also gives you the line amount, the description, quantity outstanding, invoiced, GL expense account, and instructions. So obviously you can see that if you wanted to just export this into details in Excel to do your own reporting on it, you can do so by right-clicking and doing send to Excel. Now, since I'm suggesting to create templates for each combination, you can take a look at the transaction. So I've got default values on the from warehouse and the to warehouse. So all the user has to do is do import transfers, select the template. If you're overwriting the file every time, they just hit begin import and they're done. If you're not overwriting the file name each time and you're creating a unique file, they would need to hit edit and then select the file that they're importing and then begin import. Now if you want them to not have to edit anything, so you're overwriting the file each time, you would also check post transactions, set that to yes. So that way after they import it, they're not having to go to inventory transfers, and then opening the session to post it. It's going to automatically post it into inventory. All right, another use for receipts remains disassembling items. The reason we tell customers to do so via receipt rather than a negative assembly is due to the inability to properly allocate costs to the components. There's nowhere on the assembly session that allows you to specify what the allocation percent should be, just like in a landed cost session. So the assembly session will always roll costs up from the components rather than the opposite direction. Unless you have a standard cost component, you're not going to see the proper costing if you do a negative build quantity, unless it's just one component. For those of you not utilizing track and trace, an option is to create a receipt session with a negative line for the product being broken down and positive lines for the components being added back to stock. The reason I mentioned track and trace is because track and trace relies on the source of the lot number. And if we're using a receipt to add a lot number to stock, that's where the track and trace is going to start. So if you need it to be all the way from the original receipt of the component all the way to the final good, you're going to need to use the assembly window to do this, and I'll cover that here in a moment. But if you're using receipts, the track and trace will start at the moment you post the receipt. All right, and then also when you're using a receipt, you have to make sure to verify the allocation for the breakout of the cost of the products being removed as well as the components that you're adding back. So before posting, I suggest printing the receipt session to ensure the total cost of the transaction is 0. This way you're accurately removing one item with the proper unit cost and allocating that cost to the items being created by this process. All right, so let's take a look at inventory receipt session that shows this. So right here, I've got B85, and let's open that product. So I've got B85 with a -1, and that unit cost is $9.95, because in warehouse F, the unit cost is $9.95 for B85. Now, B85 is a case of 10, but let's say I want to break down that case and I want to have just 10 of these plastic folders in stock. So what you do is you add the item that you're adding to stock by breaking this product down as another positive line with a quantity of 10, because that's how many you're adding to stock if you remove one case, with a unit cost of 0.995, which is an amount of $9.95. So if I post this, it's going to remove one case of the B85 and it's going to add 10 units of B85 each to stock, and the net value of this transaction is going to be 0. The same concept goes if you're creating multiple items by breaking one down. So let's say this case of 10 is not just a case of 10 of these. It's maybe an assorted pack of something. So I would have, I separate blue, red, and green folders out of this case of 10, and black folders just to make it even. So you would allocate the number of the items that you're breaking out and make sure that unit cost totals the unit cost of the final good the good that you're breaking apart in your warehouse. If this is something that you're going to do regularly, you can actually create a receipt import to do so. So that way you have the full functionality of Excel to create your allocation of the unit cost of the item you're breaking down. And then you can create default templates based on those Excel spreadsheets as well, just like the import transfer that we just did. On to assemblies. Inventory assemblies are extremely date sensitive. If you're creating assemblies for future production, you'll need to be aware of the difference between session or transaction date and document date. The transaction date is the date which the final good is being added to stock and the components are being removed from stock. The document date is the date that the session was created. So if you need to track how long it takes you from creation to posting, you would track the standard lead time based on the difference between the document date and the transaction date. We've had some customers in the past using them the opposite way and complaining about the need to constantly adjust their inventory to ensure there's enough on hand of the components to post the session. So let's say you create an assembly session today, but it's not posted until next week. And as you're waiting on this to be posted, you're actually receiving some of the raw materials in your warehouse. So make sure the person posting the assembly session is aware that they need to toggle the session date prior to posting the transaction, so that way the current quantity on hand as of the date that they're posting it are taken into account when creating this finished good. Because otherwise you might not have enough components on hand if you keep the date the same. Because as I said a minute ago, you could have received raw materials in the interim which give you enough component quantity on hand. And let's just take a look at those two dates here. Actually, these dates are on all transactions, so the session date is the date that the transaction is going to be posted into inventory. And the document date is the date that I would leave as the date that it was created. Unless, like for a receipt, if you wanted to track the document date on the date of the receipt, like the pack ticket, the pack list that your vendor sends it with you or to you on. All right, for those of you doing multi-level assemblies, you've also got some options. One option is to use the assembly management tool in the business alerts menu to create assemblies based on demand. For multiple levels, you would create the final level as the first session, refresh the tab on business alerts to create the next level assembly session. The assembly management tab creates sessions based on demand, which is why you have to create the last step first before you see the demand for the components listed in that last step in the list. Another option is to manually create the assembly session and add transactions to get to the final good. So this means transaction 1 in the session will be the first step needed to get to step 2. Transaction 2 will be the second step needed to get to step 3, and so on until you've got a session that goes all the way from the first step to the final step. Acctivate will post the transactions in the order they're entered while posting the session as a whole. If you wanted to post the entire process in one session, but you have multiple transactions within it, that's how you would do it. You would just use transactions within the session because it'll post the entire list of transactions whenever you post that session. If you're using lot or serial control, you would need to post each step to create the lot prior to posting the next step. This is due to the need of having quantity on hand to post an assembly session. You have to have quantity on hand of the components. You will not have a lot serial number on hand if it hasn't been posted yet. So for those of you, again, that are using lot numbers, you're going to have to create those as separate sessions. And we will cover that in a second. Another thing related to assemblies is standard costed items on assemblies will require the proper setup of said item, which is what we discussed a moment ago, setting that offset GL account on the warehouse and assigning the standard cost to the item. When an assembly has a labor item or other fee, the standard cost of this component is rolled up into the final good when posting. The offsetting portion of this topic depends on the scenario. So the first option is in-house labor. So you're not going to need a PO or a vendor bill because you're paying internal labor as your payroll. So your in-house labor will be offset by a general journal entry to something like payroll expense, which in turn would be offset by your cutting your checks to your employees. We don't suggest using payroll expense as the offset account to give you an interim step, and then you'll need to move it from whatever the GL account that you have set as a labor offset account to payroll expense to pay your employees. The second option would be subcontracted labor, which we see that a lot as well. Subcontracted labor items would be offset by creating a purchase order for the labor item with the matching number of units being billed for. So let's say you've got a number of assemblies and you used 20 hours of labor that was subcontracted labor, and you're needing to either let your subcontractor know to build these items, or you're needing to create the vendor bill for the subcontracted labor. You would create it with a labor with a quantity of 20, which is the same number of units that you use in the assembly session, and you would create that invoice in Acctivate. The invoice itself will offset the entry created when you posted that assembly session. A third option outside of using standard cost, for those of you who don't have standard cost per unit, let's say you get like discounts based on volume if you subcontract your manufacturing out, would be to utilize landed costs to allocate the fees from your subcontractor. So you would create a landed cost session and load each assembly session affected by this vendor bill and allocate the cost of that bill accordingly without the need to create a PO and a PO invoice manually. There is a fourth option which requires a few more steps and utilizes a mix of landed cost and purchase orders. It's way less common. If you have questions on another option, if none of those fall into what you need, then create a support request and we'd definitely be happy to go over that with you. So let's take a look at an inventory assembly and Acctivate, and we will look at session 75 or 76. So you can see here we have labor charges, we have labor minutes in this one, and we'll post this one so you can see the labor roll up. Preview, and this labor has a unit cost of 0.6. It used 10 minutes, which was $6. Here, let me make this a little bit bigger. $6. So the total amount for this transaction was $12.25. Since we only posted 1 pound into stock, the unit cost for this is $12.25. The transaction total is going to be 0 because the cost of the components gets rolled up into the cost of the final good. But this is how you get a cost for labor, is that standard cost assignment on the warehouse. All right, and then if you need to disassemble products using the assembly session, you can do so via the inventory assembly window, but you have to think about it in a different way than you may expect. So rather than having a build quantity be negative for the product being broken down, the component that's being created is actually listed as the component being built, using a portion of the product being broken down. I know that sounds a little confusing, so let's take a look at Acctivate again so we can visualize that a little bit better. And that's in session 75. So this is the same scenario that I did in that positive negative line receipt. You can see the each version of this is the good being created with a quantity of 10. And the quantity being pulled out of stock is 1 case. So let's say if it was another scenario where this was like an assorted case of items, you would create multiple transactions using a portion of the unit being broken down. So when you post it, you're removing 1 or however many units you're removing from stock, and you're adding back the components. But again, the final good in this scenario for the disassembly would actually be the component instead of a negative build quantity of B85. So instead of saying B85 with a negative quantity of -1 case and a positive quantity of, or a negative quantity actually, because when you post it as a negative, it would add it back to stock, would be 10. You're actually building 10 of these unique units and removing 1 case. And then something that popped up actually as I was going over some of the demonstration stuff that I covered today is backup routines. We've had some people that are affected by the recent storms on the coastlines, and they've lost data because they didn't have a backup routine already in place. We as Acctivate do not back up your Acctivate databases on our end. So if you do not have your own backup routine set up on your server or on an outside server and something happens to your data, we aren't going to be able to give you a backup to use to restore on your end unless for some reason you have sent us a backup maybe to take a look at an issue for a support request. Obviously, if you have sent us a backup for a report request in the past, that backup is most likely going to be way too outdated to restore in your current system. So I wanted to take a look at creating a backup routine. We do have obviously a help article related to creating a backup routine. We definitely suggest regular intervals of manual backups, as well as backing up on an outside drive outside of your normal server. And then you can also set up an automatic backup process through your Windows Task Manager, through the task scheduler. We do also have that one set up step by step, and you can specify the drive that goes into as well. But we can't harp on how important this is for you to create a backup routine, because again, if you lose your data and you create a support request and you say, we've lost our data, our server crashed, we don't know what to do you have a backup? Or if you request a backup from us, we're going to say, we're not the ones hosting your data, so we don't have a backup to send you. So this is why it's extremely important, because your data is incredibly valuable to your business. I mean, losing your data could be a financial crisis for your company, especially for those of you that are being hit by some of these storms. Maybe you're having to rebuild the buildings that you're in completely. So make sure you have a backup routine in place before something like that happens. So that way you're not sitting there with no data and not really sure how to rebuild everything, all the stuff that it's going to take to get all that back into Acctivate. All right, we do have one question right here. What's the difference between inventory transfer versus inventory receipt? Because I know I used both of those kind of interchangeably here for the disassembly process. A transfer moves stock from one warehouse or warehouse bin location to another warehouse or another location. A receipt will either add or remove stock from your warehouse. I used a receipt instead of an assembly session for one of those disassembly examples, because that gives you the ability to allocate the cost manually. You have more control over how that cost is allocated. If you use an inventory assembly session, you don't have a say on the way that cost is allocated, which is why I suggested flipping the way you look at a disassembly and creating the components you're adding to stock as the finished goods. But again, transfer versus receipt. A transfer is moving it from one location to another, and a receipt is receiving stock into your warehouse or correcting an incorrectly posted receipt, or breaking an item, let's say breaking a box down from, a case of 10 to 10 units. All right, is it possible to show us how to do receiving with a mobile scanner? I actually used my VM today because of it having a mobile emulator in case we got asked mobile questions. So on the mobile device, obviously I can't show you how to scan stuff because it's just an emulator here, but you would go to Inventory, Receive. You would either scan the PO or select the PO or create a standalone receipt. Obviously we suggest doing selecting the PO from either the lookup or scanning it from the printed PO form. Hit the next button, and then you either scan the barcode for the products to select it and add the quantity. It's going to default quantity to 1, by the way. Or you can scan it multiple times to bump the quantity up if you want more than 1, or you can toggle it here. So let's do A121. It defaults to 1. You can either scan A21 multiple times to add quantity, you can toggle these up and down arrows to change the quantity, or you can type it in manually. Because a lot of these devices, it doesn't show it here, but a lot of these devices have keyboards. I think this right here, yeah, right here is the keyboard for this device. You can toggle that up and down. And then you hit the green check. Do you want to post the receipt? Do you want to print product labels? Do you want to print the put away list for inventory receipts? Yes. And then it'll either post it or save it depending on the options that you have selected in Configuration Manager. Okay, and then a good question that does come up quite often is, how do I revise a customer invoice when the pricing is incorrect? Anytime you need to revise an invoice, whether that's a sales or purchase invoice, what you need to do is you need to void the invoice that you created incorrectly, modify the sales order or the purchase order to reflect the proper price and or quantity, and then recreate that invoice. And we say that because you need to make sure that what you're invoicing is going to be properly reflected in your inventory and also the cost of goods sold accounts, the entries that are sent to QuickBooks. If you change the price and the product and or the product in QuickBooks on the sales invoice that gets synchronized over from Acctivate, that will not affect Acctivate. So that's why we always suggest anything that's item related, whether it's what you've invoiced, the price that you've invoiced it, anything like that, go back to Acctivate, void the invoice, modify the document that needs to be modified, whether that's sales or purchase order, and recreate that invoice. For the sales order, whenever you recreate that invoice, it will automatically reuse the original invoice number, so it's not going to change. Like maybe, let's say you didn't charge somebody sales tax, and then you realize after you already sent them the invoice that they do need to be charged sales tax. Void the invoice, make sure there's sales tax being charged, recreate the invoice, resend it. That way, everything is accurately tracked in Acctivate and also correctly synced to QuickBooks. If you have any questions, create a support request from our help site, and we'd be happy to get in touch with you to discuss anything in more detail. Have a great day, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this month.